today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the brochure for one of my top 10 favourite cars of all time, that being the Alfa Romeo 164. I have been very lucky to have had the privilege of owning 3 Alfa Romeo 164s, 2 V6 Lusso automatics and 1 V6 Lusso manual, all of them 12 valve, all of them pre-facelift. One of them was a later pre-facelift, which you can usually tell because it had smaller window buttons and seat controls, whereas the early ones had much larger buttons. The electrics were slightly more reliable, and it didn't have rust around the rear arches, which some of the sort of poorer maintained examples would actually get. Later ones seemed a little bit more better rust protection wise. The way I like to think of them is they are basically, if you went to Italy and said to Alfa Romeo, build us the Rover 800, this is what you would get. Very similar car in concept, although the Alfa Romeo handles a heck of a lot better and drives a lot better than an 800. Although inside, they're not quite as nice plastic-wise. The Alfa Romeo is a little bit more plasticky inside. However, from a looks perspective, I mean, Mark 1 800 is a good-looking car in my personal view. But the Alfa Romeo 164 is just absolutely stunning. I remember seeing these when I was sort of 9 or 10 or so when they first came out and thinking, my God, that is amazing. I really want to own one day. And lo and behold, I did, around sort of 14 years later. They were styled by Pininfarina. They were based on the same basic Type 4 platform that was shared with the Saab 9000, Lancia Thema and the first generation Fiat Chroma. But Alfa Romeo went their own way with the styling. But the floor pan, suspension components, and other components, I think the air conditioning system was shared with Saab, if I remember rightly. There's a lot of Bosch electricals in the engine bay because the engine management was basically Bosch Motronic, if I remember rightly, in its various guises. I think the windscreen was shared with the other Type 4 vehicles, but I'm not 100% certain on that. And some of the internal structure, certainly front inner wings, was shared. Saab went their own way with the rear suspension. So on Saab's, on the 9000, they actually had a solid beam, twist beam rear axle. Whereas on the Chroma, Thema and 164, they had fully independent rear suspension with McPherson struts. So it's basically McPherson struts all round. Not sure why Saab went that way. Apparently having a rear axle that slides more readily is actually better for driving in snow. I don't know. There were reasons behind it, but actually to build, the Saab version was probably the most expensive one to build, and apparently actually lost Saab money on every one that they made. I don't know how true that is, but again, that's something that I have read. You need to take these things with a pinch of salt and do your own investigation and look at sort of official sources, not what some bloke off the internet who likes cars has said, which seems to be something that other UK automotive channels seem to do very successfully, is talk about things that they have read, and because they're obviously reading them from a bit of paper, that means it's all official. Yeah. No. Anyway, so this one is obviously a base model. The base models were 2 litres and used a rather interesting twin spark solution. So effectively you had a spark plug per cylinder and an extra spark plug. This one is obviously the Cloverleaf. Early models were all 12 valve V6s, later models were 24 valve. And they used the legendary Busso V6 in this guy is actually in transverse installation. So originally it was an engine that was designed for longitudinal deployments, and in the 164 I think was its first use as a transverse unit. Now this is what I mean about the buttons. This one's actually a later version because these buttons are rather small and discreet, whereas the early ones had much larger, clunkier buttons, which were actually less reliable than these later ones. Early models also had electric rear seats, which was something that was deleted on the later versions, if I recall correctly. So what else have we got? We've got another, oh yeah, here we go, another page which actually shows us the dashboard. Now this was one of my favourite elements of the car, was the instrument cluster. Clear displays for speedo and tacho, and individual readouts for battery, oil, engine temperature and fuel level, if I remember rightly. This one always worried me because you also had a light next to it, which I think was fed by a separate circuit. So I remember one occasion going to the top of Porlock Hill, onto the top of Exmoor, and my 1643 litre oil warning pressure light came on. And I'm thinking, oh crap. However, the needle was reading at 4, so I think 4 bar, if I remember rightly, which is the normal position that it read when warm and running. The engine wasn't making any undue rattling noises, and I carried on driving, and after a short while the light went out, so no problems at all. That car eventually failed due to the ZF automatic transmission that they used. There is, and I didn't discover this until many years later, that the fault I had in the transmission was actually really fixable. There is on the side of the transmission a cover which you can remove, and there were 2 gears in there which could fail. You replace those and it restored operation of the gearbox. So what effectively happened was I had first and second, no problems at all, but third and fourth never really fully engaged. The box itself should apparently have lock-up in second, third and fourth, if I remember rightly. So first and second, no problems whatsoever, but third and fourth, it would almost be like a slipping clutch in third and fourth. It would go into third and fourth, but never properly, and the fault just happened suddenly one day. I was very particular with the gearbox as I replaced the filter and all 8 litres of Dex 2 on a sort of a yearly basis, and yeah, it still failed on me, but apparently the fix was actually something I could have done. Citroën used, I think they used a 4HP20 in the XM, and it was a similar issue that affected XM owners. And it was actually on a Citroën dedicated site that I found the fix for the transmission issue. I kicked myself because I had no space for the car and I had to send it to scrap. So, yeah, the things you learn after the event. Anyway. I did also own a 164 manual, 3-litre V6 manual, 12 valve, and that was a very enthusiastic drive. Torque steer was absolutely chronic, in hilarious quantities. The facelifted pre-facelift model, so the mid sort of pre-facelift run, they did manage to sort out a lot of that torque steer, but yeah, they were still quite a handful. I think if I recall rightly, they did have equal length drive shafts, but it was equal length from an intermediate shaft which sat on the transmission or sat on the engine block down to what would be the near side wheel, and then or was it the offside? I can't remember. Yeah, sorry, it was the offside. So intermediate shaft to the offside, or in the UK driver's side wheel, and then the same length shaft down to the passenger side wheel. So it was kind of equal length, but not quite equal length, if that makes sense. So you had a rigidly mounted intermediate shaft, which was quite a nice feature and something that you didn't see too much on other cars of this sort of era, other front-wheel drive, high-powered cars. The interiors were a mixture of very pleasant and very cheap, and you could kind of forgive it because of the way the interior actually looked. I mean, it was a very futuristic-looking car inside, so you could easily forgive it for those sort of really inconsequential downsides. The engine itself was absolutely fantastic. Now, one thing that you had to be wary of with these was some of the earlier cam belt tensioners were oil fed and they could potentially leak. So you always had to be wary of what version the car had when you sort of came about to replacing them. I think that one there was the water pump. No, sorry, that was the water pump there. That's the power steering pump, air conditioning compressor, alternator. I had one of those fail once, and it literally just sort of collapsed internally, but was relatively easy to replace. The cam belt I never actually had to replace because I didn't own the cars. Unfortunately, I didn't own the cars long enough to warrant a cam belt change. But again, that would have been something that would have been fairly routine on one of these engines. I don't think it was like the 155 or 156 where you had to remove the engine to do the cam belt. You could do it in situ, although in the case of the 155 and 156, if you disconnect a couple of engine mounts, you can jack the engine up to a certain position to be able to get the cam belt in view, lower it down and do it that way, which was funny enough the same story with the Rev 800. Using the Honda V6, you would remove the covers, you jack up to remove the bottom covers, bring it down again, remove the top covers, or other way around. Then you would sort of a combination of jacking it up and lowering it down, having disconnected one of the engine mounts, in fact the engine mount going to the side of the engine, you could then get everything sorted out, water pump, tensioner, all of that kind of stuff. The system used in this was Bosch Motronic. Incidentally, this distributor cap is also shared with the BMW M30 straight six, so there's a bit of parts knowledge for you. A lot of the sensors are just pure Bosch, so if you can get the Bosch part number, you can probably get them a lot cheaper from other manufacturers rather than going to specific Alfa Romeo specialists. Now, the one thing that I did always find about this engine was it had an unbelievable amount of low-down torque. It was a really good torquey engine. Wasn't all that efficient, but it really wasn't bad at all when it came to sort of levels of performance. Fuel economy wasn't quite so hot on, to be honest with you. But, you know, you don't really sort of worry about that when you own one, as the rest of the car was such a nice car to drive. You sort of kind of forgave it for its fuel economy inadequacies. Now, interestingly, this is a cutaway of the transmission. So it was a ZF4HP18, if I remember rightly. These were the two gears which I was referring to earlier, and that is the removable cover. And I think it was these two where the problems developed, because I think they connected the third and fourth, or was it? No, I can't remember now. I think those clutches are... One of these clutches is actually adjustable. So if you remove the valve block, which sat on the top of the gearbox, you could actually adjust this clutch here, which was the clutch band first gear. I initially thought that was my problem, but it was a clutch band that needed adjusting. However, I adjusted the one for first gear, and it made the car incredibly strong in first gear. But the rest of the gears performed in the same way. You could, I think it was something under this cover, was where the problem lay, and as I say, I never got to the end, never got to the bottom of it, much to my regret, if I'm going to be honest. The 2 litres I don't think were available with the automatic transmission. It was only the V6s that were available with the automatic transmission. Now, the front suspension, rear suspension. So, fairly conventional at the front. McPherson struts, lower arms, very sort of standard setup, subframe, etc, etc. Nothing really out of the ordinary there. Really, it was sort of quite a conventional car from a suspension and engineering perspective. The rear had these sort of trailing arm arrangements and always reminded me of the T12 and T72 Nissan Bluebird. It was a very sort of Nissan style setup, fully independent, but quite conventional in its layout as well. Although certainly for a large front-wheel drive car at the time, quite unique. And certainly larger front-wheel drive cars of the time, some of them were still using non-independent rear ends. So this was sort of quite, not a market first, but it was sort of quite a sort of a different approach for the time. The other thing that they were very big on was rust proofing. So quite a lot of the car was actually galvanised, and overall it really sort of did improve Alfa Romeo's reputation for build quality and longevity. You could say it was the car that saved Alfa Romeo. Certainly at the time that's what a lot of sort of motoring pundits were saying. And now when you sort of look back on them, they were in the range of Alfa Romeos, a very positive car, very positive memory. It's not like the Alfa Psi, which had a very mixed reputation. The 164 is remembered with much fondness, and I think that sort of has translated to values today. So what options did we have? Well, pretty much everything from twin spot Lusso upwards had ABS. The only options, only options on the lower spec models were ABS, sunroof and metallic paint. Automatically variable dampening was only available on the Cloverleaf, and Recaro seats also only available on the Cloverleaf as well. It wasn't even an option on the lower spec models. Air conditioning was only available, I think, on the Lusso, 3-litre V6 Lusso and Cloverleafs. It may have also been on the 2-litre twin-spot Lusso. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, if I'm going to be honest. It might actually tell us here. Let's have a look. So we have... Ooh, Pioneer CD radio. It doesn't actually say. That's interesting. Oh, sorry, there it is. Automatic climate control, optional on all models, but standard on the V6 Lusso and the Cloverleaf. And if I recall, the whole setup was basically a Saab system that was also used in the 9000, albeit with different controls. Another random stupid factoid is there were some clips that mounted the door cards, or allowed you to sort of mount the door cards, and they were there to basically stop rattling the top of the door cards. Those clips, little gold things about sort of an inch in length, were VW Audi parts. So yeah, the weird things that you sort of find out when dismantling a car for repairs or parts. It's a bit like the connector for the dashboard cluster, for the dash cluster on a K11 Micra. Certainly a post 98 model. is a VW Audi part, also apparently used in the Mark IV Golf for exactly the same purpose, connecting the dash cluster. So yeah, again, weird things that you find out. And I've got to be honest, that is basically the end of the video. That's enough of me waffling, I think, for 20 minutes. I'd like to... I was going to thank everybody for watching, but I'm actually first now trying to find a date on this, so I can actually exactly date this brochure. It's going to be post 89, because that's when the later switches were used, but it's going to be before the main facelift, which saw the introduction of the 24 valve V6. So I put this brochure probably around 1990 or so. Anyway, that is it. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and see you soon.